Hello, welcome to Unit 3. We're doing the American West and the American Indian. And so the start of this unit is about the base of the conflict between Native Americans and this concept called the frontier and the closing of it. And so the focus question is, why did westward population expansion cause a crisis on the Great Plains, and how did that crisis resolve? So that's what you're going to be asked to answer using the book and this lecture. So, start us off. Here's a picture of a bison. If this was in school, I'd basically just have us look at this for a minute, and then I would ask you, you know, how would you use every part of this bison if you were a tribe that lived on the Great Plains? And student answers have ranged from, oh, I'll take the horn and use it for drinking, and that's right. I'll take the fur and I'll wear it to keep myself warm, and that's also true. Make bags out of the guts, and that's also correct. I had a kid say, I'll make a decoration out of its nose, which turned out to be something that the spiritual leaders would use as like a little fetish, basically, just a symbol of the bison's power. So that was a commonly used religious item. The hooves could be turned into gelatin. The bones could be turned into teepees. And this is the series of Native American cultures that actually use teepees. Um, and so there's a phrase, the whole buffalo, and so everything from this animal was used because it was a kind of self-sustaining hunter-gatherer society. Oh, including the buffalo chips, which are the dried feces of the buffalo, because there are no trees on the Great Plains. So for cook fires, be used using bison chips as you're cooking your bison stew or eating your bison sausage. So, whole buffalo right there. So, the history of America is a history of westward expansion and westward population growth. This map shows you the center of population of the United States from the close of each decade, from 1790 to 1890. Beginning of the country, it was right around the Baltimore, Maryland area. By 1890, the center of population in the country is roughly in the middle of Indiana. Nowadays, if you look at a map of the U.S., it's roughly in Missouri and starting to kind of trend down towards Arkansas. So we're moving, more and more Americans are moving west and south, and that's been the pattern forever. The oops, I slipped ahead of slide. This map shows you how quickly it would take to go west. So in 1800, from New York City to where we live, it would be roughly, you can count the lines out, one, two, three. So three lines, so 3 days of travel, and the method would have been by foot or by horse. There were no railroads between New York and Western Mass in the 1800s, or I'm sorry, in 1800. Down here, where it says 4 weeks, that's ship travel to New Orleans. So I just would invite you to kind of look at the spot here, New Orleans and Western Mass, for kind of gauging how quickly people start moving. So 1830, same person, 30 years later wants to travel from New York to Hatfield. It takes them a day. And that's because railroads have been invented and they've been built, and your rate of travel goes up by 3. I think it was 4 weeks for New Orleans. Now it's 2 because we have steam engines. And so the ships no longer need to rely on the wind for travel. And now, to getting into this unit's content, traveling from New York to the west in 1857, and you can see, by the way, it's less than 1 day now to get to Hatfield from New York City. To get to where Los Angeles is, it'd be roughly 3 weeks. You can see there's kind of all these crazy lines. So those basically represent areas that are harder to get to because there are mountains in the way. Oops, and I skipped ahead. But by 1930, from New York to Los Angeles is 3 days by rail. And that is something that allows many, many, many more people and that population to move out west, and that population center to shift with them. So immigration is part of this story. This is New York City, and it basically shows you, if you looked at it, it's a map from the 1800s showing the ethnic composition of each neighborhood and the population density. Um, just a history note. This is one of the few resources we actually have to figure out the population density of the city of New York in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, because the city archives burned in 1920 after returning soldiers from World War I's magazine blew up. So all the records were destroyed. And so this is one of the few kind of resources we have to kind of work backwards. Long story short, New York was overcrowded and people were dying of disease in those tenements. And so moving out west was a good idea for a lot of folks. This shows you population density of the United States. Darker colors are more people. And this one, I believe, is right before the Civil War. This is right after the Civil War, and that transcontinental railway being built that allowed that 3 days of travel to get to the West Coast. Again, the darker areas are high in population. You can see again New York, that city with all the immigrants going to it, the densest. Boston, Philadelphia, kind of the Northeast is the densest area. People move from here, just like they do now, to all these other areas of the country, and that's how they get their large populations too. Similar idea, except this one shows you this is in the same time period, but it's basically where there are more women and where there are more men. So the East, more women than men. In the West, more men than women, largely because a lot of young men, 18 to 25, would leave for the West and either not return or stay out that way. And there ended up being a population imbalance in the population, which is just not the case any longer because the movement isn't as big. It was just an interesting kind of historical note. Again, this is 1930, and the country kind of evens out in population density, relatively speaking. The East is still more populated, the West is not, but it's more balanced. A lot of these kind of blank white areas are deserts. Here you can see the same thing using lights in 1990, and the intensification of light by now, this is 20 years old, so if you looked at a new map, it would be even brighter. So, there's a couple phrases I want to just kind of talk about between on this first slide here. So this is, if you remember from way back in US 1, the 13 original colonies and the proclamation line of 1763. What the proclamation line did is it prevented white settlement, and this is, again, this would have been the beginning of your sophomore year, or I'm sorry, your beginning of your freshman year. It prohibits white settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. That line was considered to be the frontier between, quote, civilization and the barbarians west of those Appalachian Mountains. Part of the reason the American Revolution happened is the settlers, so this is going to get back to that phrase settler colonialism in the 13 colonies, wanted to basically take over the Native American land and use it for what they thought was a superior purpose. And so the basic idea behind America's colonies was that the original population of an area needed to be replaced with a new one of settlers. And so you're thinking back to the Trail of Tears that helps destroy this Indian reservation King George set up over here. And that's really one of the roots of American history is the settler colonialism, and the other one is American slavery, as we've talked about many times. So again, replacing the native population with new settlers is part of the original history of the U.S. So this is a painting of the Trail of Tears. The Andrew Jackson presidency, basically with the aid of Georgia, sent Native Americans west of the Mississippi River in the middle of winter, and roughly a third of them died after having signed many treaties with presidents like George Washington, promising that wouldn't happen. And so, kind of talking about Native Americans of the West, it's also really, really important to note that it's impossible to talk about a specific Native American culture. And that's because there are thousands of Native American cultures, as you can see even just by these two images. The young women dancing above, I believe, are part of the Navajo Nation. The gentleman down below is wearing a traditional dress of the Algonquin Indians of the Northeast, so the area that you grew up in. But very different, colors in the clothing, very different culture. A lot of this has to do with geography. So cultures that are, like the Klamath in the American Northwest. So this is based in modern day Oregon and Washington. Largely live on salmon. They don't have any bisons. They're not using the whole buffalo the same way as the Plains Indians. And they never settle down and do agriculture. Areas near Mexico become farmers because they've got the technology of the Aztec agricultural practices. And so you have a different kind of more settled society. There have been 1 million Native Americans, and largely disease and warfare brings that number down to 250,000 in the U.S. by 1865. So if we're going to make a generalization about Native American culture, one of the things we can generalize and say is they didn't go through the feudal history of Europe, so the concept of private property doesn't exist in the same way in these cultures. The idea that somebody can own land, like a king might own land and grant it to their barons or their knights, is imported to the U.S. It isn't homegrown, if you will. This is an image of Native American ghost dancers, and so these are some of the Plains Indians. This is one of the few photographs. Um, and you can see a couple of them are wearing hats they got from U.S. soldiers. This is the Arapaho in, I believe it's southwest Arizona or New Mexico. I can't recall right off the top of my head. And you can see the Mexican Aztec kind of culture with the eagle symbology. If you look at, say, the Mexican flag nowadays, there's an eagle on it eating a snake because that comes from the same root Aztec culture that's being depicted in this image. So this video that's right here, it's a YouTube video. I recommend watching it, and it basically shows a time lapse. And actually, I'll play in the background with the sound off. A time lapse of Native American land losses, and you can look at this video that's going on and just really see the story. Um, Getting back to slavery, much of the land opened up by Andrew Jackson and later U.S. presidents and governments, stolen from Native Americans, ends up being slave-grown or enslaved people picking cotton on plantations. Land of the West is reserved, which is kind of, I put in sarcastic quotes because it had originally been their land. So some segments were left, and anytime gold or silver is discovered, the peace treaties granting that land are generally disregarded. The railroads, when they come through the West, they demand an exclusive right of way, which means the train has the right to go this direction, which destroys the right of way of the bison. And so the railroad companies will just shoot bison or try to set traps for them, starving the Native Americans on the plains of their main food source. Eventually, the U.S. Army gets involved in the bison extermination efforts of these railroad companies, and this is an image of bison skulls that have just been shot by the U.S. Army, and the skulls are destined to be ground up into fertilizer, kind of completing that settler colonialism. So the bison's destroyed, Native American culture can no longer live there. The bones of the bison are ground down into fertilizer, so new white settlers can grow crops on that former Native American land. So the American Civil War is a war between the North and the South, but it's also a war that results in absolute disaster for the Native Americans. And so you can see in this advertisement that while that war between the North and the South is going on in kind of the eastern United States, the U.S. cavalry is fighting the Native Americans in the West. And so the Sioux in particular use the opportunity of less U.S. military involvement in the West because they're fighting the Civil War to rise up against an invasion of their land in Minnesota and modern day Minnesota. The Cheyenne is a tribe that's basically targeted because the Sioux are rising up in Minnesota, and the Colorado militia shoots hundreds of men, women, and children at the Sand Creek massacre, basically as kind of this is as they're waving American flags and talking about how much they love this country, and it's kind of a symbol of the era. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 ends this conflict, basically because the U.S. Army, after the Civil War, is now available again to go crush any resistance that's happening. So this group of folks in the background, these women wearing the bonnets and these gentlemen wearing the kind of suits, are called the Friends of the Indian, and they are basically largely former anti-slavery reformers from the Northeast who think it's their job to kill the Indian to save the man. And what they mean by that is they disagree with the warfare policy of the U.S. government. They're pacifists, generally speaking, and they think the way to save Native Americans from being murdered by the U.S. military is to basically turn them and assimilate them into the majority white culture. This is a Native American drawing of the Sand Creek Massacre. And you can see the American flag right here. Oh, this is a painting of, so locally, the city of Turner's Falls, which is part of Montague, this is where the modern day Turner's Falls Dam is in this painting. That city, just to remind you that the story is true in the East as well as the West, was founded basically when Captain Turner murdered Native Americans who were women and children who were at the bottom at kind of the camp while they were sleeping, and it was considered to be a great victory, and that's why they named the city after him. And you can see even on the monument, as far as how history, is kind of created. It says Captain William Turner with 145 men surprised and destroyed over 300 Indians encamped at this place. Not mentioning that this was not a tribe at war with the English settlers or anything like that. So, kind of shifting, the former generals of the Civil War end up becoming Indian fighters. So Sherman's March to the Sea, which breaks the back of the Confederacy, is followed by General William Sherman writing to his political leaders in Washington, if 50 Indians are allowed to remain between the Arkansas and the Platte rivers, they would checkmate 3,000 soldiers. So Sherman advocates for war against the Sioux and the Cheyenne, and basically the Bozeman War and the Red River War break out. So this is basically the war in the north in Montana and one down south in Texas. So Bozeman is the one in basically the area of modern day Montana and Wyoming. And the Sioux, after being pushed out west by the U.S. Army during the Civil War, are pushed even further west into reservations after they resist the building of forts into their territory. Down south, the Bozeman War is basically in the middle of the Civil War. West Texas is largely under Native control. There's nobody who is of white extraction who's basically there because it's desert. It's not really cotton growing land. And again, the Civil War is going on. This one is about bison hunting. New technology is invented that allows bison hides to be used for commercial use. And so the last remaining herds that weren't killed in the earlier wars are hunted down to become gloves and hats in Texas during the Bozeman War. I'm sorry, the Red River War. The Comanches surrender in 1875, and they're last of the southern tribes to do so. And this is kind of the landscape that's being fought in here. The Sioux Wars are again, the Sioux are back. This is Chief Sitting Bull, and they are consistently resisting westward expansion and consistently being pushed back. General Custer in 1874, who's a part of the U.S. Cavalry, discovers gold in the land set aside as a Sioux reservation and effectively tells folks in the East about this and publishes this information, and a gold rush ensues. Predictably, the Sioux resist encroachment on their land, and the Sioux are crushed by Custer, even though they initially win a battle against General Custer, which is in this video, and it's worth seeing. But long story short, General Custer camps at the bottom of a hill and is arrogant enough to think that the Native American savages won't be able to destroy him. There's Custard. He was considered very handsome back in the day. I think it probably was all the bow tie doing all the work. So, broken arrows, broken treaties. Here is the Sioux reservation was supposed to be basically half of South Dakota. You can see everything that's colored on it that's not pink was part of the Sioux reservation. After the result of these Sioux wars, all that remains in the modern era are these kind of disconnected red chunks. So that idea of divide and conquer is what happens to the Native Americans. There's the tribe that basically helped Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea, if you remember back from probably elementary school. It's called the Nez Perce, and they had never fought a war with the United States. They had converted to Christianity. They had again, helped out with U.S. government initiatives, and eventually American farmers want their land, and so the U.S. government tries to force them onto a smaller, worse reservation. They try to escape, almost make it to Canada. The U.S. cavalry rounds them up and stops them about less than 100 miles from the border. And this is an image of the Nez Perce. So basically, Chief Joseph leaves his tribe, and basically does a running battle with the U.S. cavalry all the way through these hundreds and hundreds of miles of Montana until finally being caught. So this is a map of it. It's a really very long journey. The last battle in the Native American Wars is the Battle of Wounded Knee. And so, defeat after defeat after defeat, betrayal after betrayal, crushing of a culture, missionaries are going in. You've got, so-called Friends of the Indian trying to encourage Native Americans to be like the white man and give up their culture and become farmers. And so there was a prophet that rose up amongst the Sioux who preached this story, basically saying that the white man is going to be burned away like a prairie fire. The buffalo is going to return if the Native Americans give up the corrupting influences from white culture, like alcohol and Christianity. And basically, there are this dress that you're supposed to wear, these white shirts. And if you wear them, and if you believe hard enough, then the white man's bullets won't be able to harm you. This religion, this cult, this movement politically, whatever you want to call it, spreads throughout most of the Native American reservations in the West. And it's kind of a revival of religion in a lot of ways. In the end, agents of the federal government within the Sioux tribe murder Chief Sitting Bull, who had nothing to do with the ghost dance. And then at the Battle of Wounded Knee, the unarmed natives participating in their ghost dance ritual were murdered by the army, and that was declared to be the end of the Sioux Wars and the end of Native American resistance. And so this is a pretty grotesque image, but this is the burial of people after the Battle of Wounded Knee, none of whom were armed. They're frozen stiff. It's, and you've got all these armed gentlemen in the U.S. Army, so-called gentlemen, who have just murdered Native Americans because that was the policy of the federal government. Helen Hunt Jackson was a woman who was a contemporary of this, and she wrote a book at the time called The Century of Dishonor. I'm just going to read you a quote of it because I think it's worth it. It makes little difference where one opens the record of the history of the Indians. Every page and every year has its dark stain. The story of one tribe is the story of all, varied only by differences of time and place. Colorado in 1880 is as greedy and unjust as Georgia in 1830, as Ohio in 1795. The United States government breaks promises as definitely as then, and with the added ingenuity of long practice. She goes on and basically ends up with this argument that Native Americans need to be assimilated. She was friends with Emily Dickinson, just by the way. This is Helen Hunt Jackson on the right. The last part of this is the victory, in a sense, of the Friends of the Indian. To kill the Indian to save the man. The idea was people like Jackson thought that Native Americans needed to become farmers and become white effectively and stop living on the reservation. They thought the reservation was the problem and what Native Americans were doing. So anyone living on a Native American reservation who is of the tribe would have to give up their tribal title, their tribal citizenship, and they would be granted 160-acre homesteads for each Indian family. If they didn't take up this offer, any leftover land would go to whites. This happened in many, many cases, and you can see it's pretty clear. But in 1911, this is when this is going on. So only a little bit more than 100 years ago, there's basically Native American lands being sold at auction if they were too mistrustful to convert to white culture. And the end result, 1865 before the Dawes Act, 1880 before the Dawes Act, and by 1990, this is the end result of this law. Long, sad, consistent history.